I always thought I knew my wife. We had been together for many years, and I believed that our love was more than just a feeling, it was more than that. We had been through a lot, but we always supported each other despite the difficulties life threw at us. I was sure that I could rely on her, that she was my support, my soul mate. Our life seemed perfect. 2 wonderful children, a stable job, a home in which we were building a future. We laughed, shared moments of joy and hardship. I remembered how we met, how easy she was to live with, how confident she was that we were a team. I saw sincerity in her eyes and trust in her smile, but that day I realized how deceptive trust can be. My life changed in an instant. I walked into the conference room, as usual, with a bouquet of flowers, full of joy and pride in her. We had both accomplished a lot and I wanted to share this moment with her. I knew she would be on stage, that she had prepared an important presentation. This was her day, but instead of greeting me with a smile and joy as usual, she greeted me with some strange expression on her face. I didn't immediately realize what was going on. She didn't look surprised, she didn't look embarrassed by my appearance with the bouquet. There wasn't that usual sincerity in her eyes. And that's when I saw him. The man she was talking to, the man she was laughing with. The man she was so close to, as if I didn't exist. In that moment, something shivered inside me. Time slowed down. My hand with the bouquet in it trembled. My heart froze, and before my eyes stood only this man, my wife, smiling the way she used to smile only at me. At that moment I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to react. All I knew was that my life had just been destroyed, and I didn't even know where to begin to rebuild it. I stood at the door of the conference room, bouquet in hand, full of hope. I knew she was busy getting ready, and I wanted to surprise her. I dreamed of seeing her eyes when she noticed the flowers. Sensing how much these little things I did for her meant to me. It had been a long time since I'd thrown a surprise for her, but I decided today was the day to do just that. It was my way of expressing my pride in her and her accomplishments. I was sure she would be pleased, but when I walked into the gym, everything changed. Initially, I couldn't understand what was going on. I thought it looked like business as usual. The hall was filled with people, they were standing in groups discussing various issues. My wife was standing in the center of the group, talking to the men, as one does at such events. But something was not right. I couldn't figure out what it was until I saw him. He was standing next to her, very close. His hand was on her back and her face was turned toward him. The smile on her lips was one I hadn't seen in a long time. She was laughing, and her eyes sparkled with something I couldn't understand. Her gaze was warm, open, like it used to be when she looked at me. But it wasn't toward me. She was looking at him the way she had once looked at me. The seconds dragged on, but there was so much in them. 1,000 thoughts flashed through my mind, but they were all scattered. Jumbled, as if something had collapsed and I didn't know how to put the pieces together. I stood, and the world seemed too vivid, as if everything around me was happening at once. I stood at the door, not knowing what to do next. My heart started beating faster and faster. I saw her turn toward me, and her gaze was lost in my figure for a moment. But her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't rush toward me like she always did. Her smile wasn't happy, she didn't look pleased at my appearance. Her eyes ran down my face, and I felt the tension creep into her gaze. She didn't say anything. Didn't even try to hide anything. I saw her mouth open slightly, but no words came out. She tried to say something. But nothing came out. I stood there watching and my mind kept going back and forth. The man next to her noticed my gaze. He obviously sensed the tension and took a step back. That was the moment when I realized for the first time that I didn't know who this man was. I saw his face, but I couldn't remember who he was. I couldn't understand how he ended up here, with her. I froze. Everything around me was silent, as if time had stopped. My hand with the bouquet in it shook, and I felt my breathing become labored. For a second I thought the whole room was watching us. I felt the warmth in my chest change to cold. I didn't even realize I was walking toward them. "Hi," I said, trying to gather some confidence in my voice. But she wasn't sure. My wife turned to me, and her face became tense. She was trying to hide something. But I saw something in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't the genuine joy I expected to see. There was anxiety in her eyes, something strange and ridiculous. I didn't know exactly what it meant. You've come," she said, and her voice sounded like I hadn't heard it in a long time. It wasn't soft, it wasn't warm. It was mechanical, as if she were repeating words that had no meaning. "Yes, I'm here," I said, trying to understand how this was all possible. I felt my hands begin to shake. I looked at her and tried to figure out what was going on. I wanted to ask her a question, but the words stuck in my throat. Everything was so ridiculous, so foreign. I felt like I was standing in a hazy dream where nothing mattered. It's an important meeting," she said, trying to justify her behavior. But I knew it wasn't. I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I felt like I couldn't believe her or myself anymore. The man next to her finally said something, but I couldn't hear his words. My gaze was fixed on my wife, who was now avoiding my eyes. Will you explain everything to me?" I asked, not knowing what words I was choosing. Her eyes met mine for a moment, but she immediately looked away. I saw her lips twitch. She knew I understood everything. And all I heard in response was silence. I stood looking at her, not knowing what to do, how to move on. My hand with the bouquet was still in mine, but it seemed so out of place now. It was a gesture that was supposed to express love, recognition, but it lost all meaning in that moment. I looked at the man standing next to my wife. His face was calm, confident, as if everything that was happening was part of the normal pattern. But it was something foreign to me. I didn't know who he was, but his presence here, next to my wife, seemed to break out of the familiar world and burst into my reality, shattering it. My thoughts were confused. Fragments of memories popped into my head, but they didn't help me make sense of the situation. I saw her face when we met, her eyes full of fear as I walked down the hall. Why didn't she come to me right away? Why wasn't she happy to see me? I expected joy, expected her to throw herself into my arms. But instead I saw the coldness in her eyes. It was the look of a woman who had long been estranged. Hiding her feelings and perhaps no longer feeling what had once bound us together. "Honey, what's going on?" I asked with difficulty, my voice breaking. My words sounded muffled, hollow. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to hear, but I had to at least try. She sighed and lifted her shoulders slightly, as if it was the only way she could justify herself. With every movement she made, a sense of hopelessness enveloped me, as if I was facing an unimaginable abyss where my entire life was crumbling. She started to say, but stopped. Her lips trembled, and I saw her gather the strength to continue. I didn't know what she was going to say, and frankly, I wasn't ready to hear it. At that moment, the man next to her took a step forward. He held out his hand to me, but I instinctively recoiled. His attempt to show benevolence seemed fake to me, unnatural. I didn't know who he was, but something inside me, something animalistic, told me that this was the man who had torn my life apart. "You shouldn't," he started, but I interrupted him, not wanting to listen. "Who are you?" I asked, feeling the anger and bitterness creep into my voice. This question wasn't a simple one, it was a challenge. I didn't know what to think of my wife anymore, but this man who stood before me was just another link in the chain of destruction. My wife looked at him, then shifted her gaze to me. She tried to say something, but fell silent again. It was agonizing. I could feel her silence weighing on me, how the whole situation was draining me of my strength. I didn't know what else to say. I was in a trance, unable to get out of this nightmare. He's here on business," my wife finally said, but her words were unconvincing. I didn't need an explanation, I didn't need anything. I knew what was going on. I knew this meeting wasn't just work. This meeting was part of something much bigger that I didn't want to admit. The seconds dragged on, but it felt like time stood still to me. I realized that this meeting, this moment, was the beginning of the end. Everything we had built with her was crumbling right in front of me. I knew she was cheating on me, and it wasn't just a betrayal. It was a betrayal with someone with whom she shared not only physical intimacy, but also the trust one thought she had bestowed upon me. I remained silent, feeling the air around me grow heavy. It was hard for me to breathe and my chest felt like my heart was about to stop. I wanted to scream, I wanted to ask her what was going on, but instead I stayed silent. I couldn't help but notice how she was avoiding my gaze. I could feel her pulling away from me. As if I was a stranger to her, some passerby, "Can you explain it to me?" I asked, and my voice barely made it out of my chest. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer, but I was ready to hear everything. I was ready to face it head on. She sighed, but didn't answer right away. The pause dragged on, and I realized I wasn't going to be ready for what she had to say. Every word she spoke would mean the destruction of another part of my soul. I don't know what to say to you," she said finally, her voice shaking. "You can see that." I couldn't believe it. I stood looking at her, and despite her words, I tried to find something to explain the situation. But there were no explanations, no excuses. All I could see was her silence, her gaze, and this man beside her who was part of this horrible picture. My fingers tightened around the stems of the bouquet I'd held for so long. All I wanted to do was throw it into a corner, to toss it to the floor as a symbol of all that had been destroyed. But I continued to stand, unable to take a step. I clung to the bouquet like a lifeline, desperately trying to find some footing. Some meaning in this nightmare. Time seemed to cease to exist, seconds stretched on and on like an eternity. My heart was beating so loudly that I could barely hear her words, even when she tried to explain. I saw her face, but it was blank and cold, like I wasn't her husband, but some stranger she didn't want to deal with. He stood beside her, this man, with a smirk on his face, almost like a victor, like nothing had happened, like it was all some kind of routine. I didn't know what to think. I couldn't understand how this was even possible. I wanted to believe that this was all some kind of nightmare, that I would wake up in a few minutes, but unfortunately it was all too real. I saw her eyes avoid my gaze. All she was doing was throwing quick glances at the man and then lowering her gaze to the floor. I suddenly realized that she wasn't going to fight. She had already made her choice, and I was left standing there with the bouquet in my hands like an idiot, with this unbearable feeling that the world I knew had crumbled. Was this a game from the beginning? I blurted out. My voice was squeezed, but the words crawled like venomous snakes. I couldn't hold back the pain. This was more than cheating. It was the destruction of everything I'd built, everything I believed in. We were building something real, weren't we? She finally looked at me, her pity-filled eyes so foreign. She didn't try to justify herself, didn't try to explain herself. Instead, she just remained silent, pulling away more and more. I felt my heart clench, and coldness began to fill the space around me. I didn't know what I was feeling. I was trapped in my own frustration and pain. And worst of all, I didn't know what I was supposed to do now. She was there for me, but she was no longer the woman I had once dreamed of a future with. She was a stranger, and it was hard for me to admit it. "Can you explain to me how this happened?" I asked her, looking into her face, but my voice sounded hollow. I didn't believe a word she said. I just wanted answers, even though I knew they wouldn't bring relief. Her lips trembled, she opened and closed her mouth but said nothing. All I could see was fear in her eyes, fear of what she had done and fear of what she would lose. The silence was excruciating. I began to feel my gaze focus more and more on the man standing next to her. He looked at me so calmly, as if there was no guilt. He felt no shame or regret. He was just confident and smug. "Do you even realize what you've done?" I said, trying not to scream, but I was having a hard time. It was a cry of pain that I couldn't contain. It felt like I was losing not only my wife, but myself. As if she had taken a part of my soul with her the moment I walked into this room full of hope, he looked at me as if everything that was going on were trivialities that didn't deserve much attention. Doesn't he even realize that he ruined someone else's life? That he's become a part of the pain I'm in? Don't you realize what's going on? I said again, and this time my voice was firmer. Don't you see what you've destroyed? Everything I thought we had is gone. You've ruined us. She raised her head, her gaze crossing mine. I saw her eyes fill with tears, but that wasn't what I wanted to see. I didn't need her regret. I needed understanding. I needed her to at least realize what she'd done, but she couldn't do that. I don't know what to say, she whispered, but her words were nothing more than a whisper of empty phrases. She couldn't stand up for her family because she was part of the destruction herself. She was one of the reasons for the pain I was going through, and her words couldn't bring back what had been lost. I looked at the man beside her again. He stood there, with an expression I couldn't understand. This was a victory for him. He had taken what I valued most. And he had no shame. Did you think it would go without consequence? I asked, directing my gaze at the man. You don't even seem to realize what you've destroyed. At this point, he chewed his lips slightly and looked at me, but his gaze was cold, unfazed. He was ready for this. And that was what scared me the most. I could feel the tension in the air growing with every passing second, as if it were something tangible that you clutched in your hands but couldn't get rid of. I stood in front of them, with the bouquet in my hands, with this symbol of love and care that now seemed utterly ridiculous. This whole scene, this whole moment, was like a bad dream I couldn't believe. My wife, with whom I had been for many years, my partner in life and, as I thought, the person I could trust, was standing next to this man, and her face was filled not with remorse, but rather with a slight perplexity. It was as if she couldn't understand why I was even reacting so strongly. How long had it been since I'd noticed something was wrong? My breathing was coming off, and I could feel my knees weakening. All those years I had spent being faithful and caring suddenly crumbled like a house of cards. There were thousands of questions rushing through my mind that I couldn't find an answer to. Everything I had thought, all the dreams and plans I had made were gone. I didn't know what I should do or how I should be. Is this what you want? I asked her, my voice sounding muffled, as if I didn't believe in my own reality anymore. I tried to understand what was in her eyes. I tried to find some spark, some little bit of truth, but I couldn't. It was like talking to a stranger. Like I was only a part of her life until the moment her choice became obvious. I didn't know what to do with this realization. I didn't know how to pull myself together or how to keep going. It was all so foreign. She was silent, her eyes never lifting. I could see her lips trembling slightly. But it wasn't from regret. She was afraid. And not because of me, but because she could lose everything she had. But it didn't matter anymore. What are you going to do now? I asked, feeling the anger that was still somewhere deep inside start to awaken. You think you can just let this go? This isn't just cheating. You ruined our whole life. You betrayed me, you betrayed my trust. You ruined everything we had. You think you can just let it all go? At that moment, I saw her eyes meet his. She was looking for support, she was hoping that he would somehow intervene, that he would say something that would give her a chance to justify herself, but the man stood there looking at me with the same cold smile that he had met my gaze with at the beginning. He didn't even try to justify himself, and that was another knife in my heart. I felt not only rage, but deep disappointment overwhelm me with every look he gave me, with every silence. He hadn't expected this. He didn't expect me to do anything, to fight for my happiness. He won. And in that moment, I was scared because I realized that everything I had once valued no longer mattered. My wife continued to be silent, her lips quivering. Every now and then she tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. My patience was melting. I couldn't stand by and watch any longer. It was beyond me. You can't even tell me why. Why did you do it? I repeated the question, but now I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. There was no answer. It didn't matter. All I wanted was for this nightmare to end, so that I could go back to the life I had lived before, where my eyes weren't full of pain. But none of that was possible anymore. I suddenly realized that this moment, this conversation, was meaningless. Nothing I say will bring back what was lost. Nothing she said would change what had happened. Everything was ruined. I turned around to leave. But before I left, I looked at her. At her face that had once been a source of joy and peace. But now it was a face I no longer knew. "It's over," I said, and my words sounded like a sentence. It was the end of everything. In that moment, I realized that I no longer wanted to be a part of this life. I didn't know how to move on, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to wait for her to take everything away from me again. I walked out of the conference room, with a bouquet of flowers in my hands that now seemed completely out of place. I felt how hard it was for me to breathe. My heart was broken. But I knew one thing: now had to put my life back together again. As I paced down the hallway holding onto the bouquet of flowers, my heart beat faster than usual and mixed feelings ran through my head, from excitement to a kind of anxious anticipation. I thought about how nice it would be to make this surprise for her, how happy she would be to see me, because it had been so long since I had given her flowers. It had been a long time since my wife and I had spent an evening together, and I hoped that this small gesture would help to bring back at least a part of what we had between us. As I walked into the auditorium, I saw her. She was standing surrounded by co-workers, talking to someone, and her face was lit up with the same expression of happiness I loved so much about her. I felt the warmth in my chest grow and, holding my breath, I stepped closer. At that moment, it seemed to me that everything around me froze. I wanted to say something nice. Maybe ask her how her day was, or just congratulate her on her success at work. I was ready to give her that bouquet to show her how important she was to me. But when I walked into the hall and she saw me, her face changed. She froze for a moment. I couldn't understand what was going through her mind. However, the very next moment I noticed that in her eyes there was not the happiness I had expected to see, but something else: anxiety and perhaps fear. It all lasted for seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I tried to smile, but in response to my joy, her face didn't change. I walked over to her, held out the bouquet and said softly, "Hello, my love. This is for you. You look so beautiful today." But instead of seeing her sincere smile, I saw her laugh nervously, as if trying to hide some embarrassment. She accepted the bouquet, but she didn't sniff it right away, as she usually did, and she didn't say a word. There was something elusive in her eyes, like she was somewhere far away, not here with us. I felt an icy gaze sweep over me. She looked at me, but there was something in her gaze that I couldn't understand. It was something foreign. I felt my shoulders slump, like some kind of stone had lodged in my heart. I became nervous, though I didn't really know why. Anxious thoughts ran through my head, but I continued to hold her gaze. I was sure there was nothing wrong, that I was just exaggerating. I stood there, waiting for her reaction, but she never said a single word. She only took my bouquet and set it aside. "Is there something wrong with you?" I asked, still not sure what was going on. She only shrugged slightly, and I noticed her lips quivering. I figured it was just fatigue. I knew she had been working on an important project for a long time, that the workload was heavy. But here it was somehow strange that her mood had changed so drastically. At times I didn't realize what was going on when she was so nervous. There were a lot of people in the room, but suddenly everything felt kind of dim and foreign. I could feel the alienation slowly taking hold of me. Somehow at that moment, right in front of her eyes, I felt an unbridgeable gulf growing between us. She kept avoiding my gaze, trying desperately to smile, but I could see that smile becoming more and more artificial. At that moment, I realized something was wrong. Everything I thought about our marriage was in jeopardy. For a while, I felt something inside of me break. I didn't know what exactly, but the feeling became more and more apparent. I felt a chill run through my body. I kept trying to talk to her, but her responses became more and more reserved and detached. I knew it wasn't normal fatigue. But what was it? Why? Why was she suddenly acting like this? I didn't know yet, but I already sensed that the answers to those questions would be terrible. Don't you want to talk? I asked, already realizing that my words sounded hollow, but something told me I shouldn't back down. I had to realize what had happened. I wasn't prepared for what might soon be revealed. But she only nodded and said with a smile, "It's all right, love. Just a little tired." With those words, she quickly turned and started talking to one of her coworkers, while I stood there looking at her, increasingly immersed in my own thoughts. At that moment I realized, I was so far away from understanding everything that things were starting to spiral out of control. I stood in the same spot, everyone around me continued to work, talking, laughing and joking, but to me it was like everything was in slow motion. I continued to hold that bouquet, even though it now seemed completely superfluous to me. The flowers, which were supposed to symbolize happiness and warmth, now only emphasized the growing distance between my wife and me. I watched her as she continued to talk to her coworkers, but her gaze never crossed mine. It seemed she was so far away that I could barely feel her presence. I tried to convince myself that perhaps it was just temporary fatigue, that she was working too hard and that was why she was acting so strangely. But in the back of my mind I knew something much more serious was going on, and I wasn't prepared for what it might be. That chill in my chest was getting stronger by the minute, and my mind began to race with questions that I couldn't find an answer to. Why hadn't she said anything about that day? Why didn't she tell me what she had going on? We'd always shared these things, but now it was like an invisible wall had been built between us. I tried to put things into perspective, but as soon as I came to one possible explanation, another, more troubling one appeared. At some point I felt I had to talk to her, even if it meant interrupting her conversation with her coworkers. I slowly made my way toward her, and when she noticed my approach, her face changed for a moment. But the change was so subtle that I might not have noticed it if I hadn't looked closely. Her gaze became more intense, and she sort of shrank back, as if she didn't want anyone to see us together. Could it really be fatigue? I thought. But that thought couldn't calm me down. Once again I felt like I lacked the words to ask her what was going on. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it could be heard in the silence of the conference room. "Honey," I began, and my voice came through with difficulty. "What's wrong? You don't seem like yourself. Can we talk?" She looked at me, and her gaze was blank, as if I was a stranger to her. It was something strange, unsettling, but something in her eyes made me feel like it wasn't just a moment of weakness or fatigue. It was like she was hiding something. "Not now," she said without looking up, and quickly went back to talking to her coworkers. It was as if I wasn't in this space. I stood up, as if bound to the spot, and felt a cold emptiness encompass my chest. It was like I wasn't a part of her world. I stood around for a while longer, trying to figure out what I should do. At that moment, I looked at her again. She was still talking, her face was like a sculpture, unmoving and alien. I felt a lump lodged in my throat, and almost without realizing it I was overwhelmed with anger. This anger that couldn't be controlled, that perhaps arose not because of anything she'd done, but because I couldn't understand what was happening between us. Deciding that she didn't want to talk right now, I turned and headed for the exit, but as soon as I took a step, I felt her eyes following me again. I turned around and for a moment our gazes met. There was still fear in her eyes, but I saw something else too, a detachment. It was as if she was trying to close herself off from me, as if I wasn't the person she shared her life with. I left the auditorium and went to the restroom to gather my thoughts. At that moment, I felt completely alone. I needed to understand what was going on. This whole situation seemed completely foreign to me and I didn't know how I was going to deal with it. I tried to think about the good things, about how she and I had built our life together, about how wonderful everything had once been, but every time I tried to remember our moments of happiness, all I could think of was that cold scene with her face full of alienation. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered to myself, trying to keep my emotions in check. Why have you been avoiding me? What's going on? I was lost in my thoughts. At some point it became clear to me that I couldn't walk away from this situation without realizing the truth. I had to find out what was going on with her, what was causing this strange behavior. But what if I really wasn't prepared for what I would find out? What if that truth was something that would shatter everything I believed in? I needed to find answers, and I already knew my questions wouldn't go unanswered. Part 2, diving into dark waters, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground was going out from under my feet. Every morning when I woke up, I could feel how hard it was to breathe. Every morning I asked myself the same question, why? But I couldn't find an answer. Were they just random mistakes, or was the life I was building meaningless from the beginning? I continued to live with her, even though I realized it wasn't the same anymore. We were like two different people who happened to be in the same apartment but could no longer find common ground. I avoided her gaze, and she tried to appear nonchalant, but I knew there was something much deeper and more painful behind it. All this time I had hoped that she would admit her guilt, that she would at least explain to me what had happened. But she remained silent, as if nothing had happened, as if I was the one who couldn't understand. That silence became my main pain. She never opened her soul, never tried to understand me. I tried to talk to her, but her answers were detached, cold. I couldn't understand how she could be so insensitive. Every look she gave me, every gesture she made told me that she had already chosen someone else, that she was no longer my wife. But still I kept hoping that she would at least partially return to me. I often sat on the couch and thought about the past. Memories of our first meeting. Of how we met, how we fell in love, how we made plans for the future. It was all becoming unbearable for me. How could we have come to this? I remembered how on our wedding day I felt like the happiest person in the world. She was my dream, my love. But now that love was turning into unbearable pain. One day, sitting in our house, I started rereading her messages again. They wouldn't let me rest. And even though I knew it wouldn't give me peace of mind, I searched for answers again, even though I knew I wouldn't find them. But I couldn't stop. There was so much confidence in her words, so much calm. She wasn't afraid for me to see it. She had made her choice a long time ago. That's when I decided I needed to talk to him. To this man who was the cause of all my suffering. And even though I knew it would be difficult, I couldn't stop. This was my last test, my last chance to get answers. Maybe I could talk to him and understand what had caused her choice. Maybe he would explain to me why my life had fallen apart. I drove to his office, feeling my heart clench with anxiety. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I felt like I couldn't stay in this state any longer. He was at his desk when I entered. His gaze was cold, expressionless, but I saw his lips quiver slightly when he saw me. "You're here?" He asked as if nothing had happened. His voice was calm, his face impassive. "Yes, I came," I answered, though I couldn't hide my excitement. He set the papers aside and looked at me like I was some kind of irritant. But I was determined. "I want to know why. Why did you do it? Why did you take her away from me? Why did you destroy my family?" His look didn't change, but I could see the shadow of what he understood flashed in his eyes. He was ready for anything, just not to hear me ask that question. So I went on. "You knew she was married, didn't you? You knew she was my wife. Why did you decide to ruin everything?" He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Do you really want to know?" His voice was quiet and calm. I nodded, not taking my eyes off him. "Do you think it's my fault? Do you think I did something wrong? We all make choices, and you can't blame me for her choosing me. If you'd been around, maybe things would have been different. But you weren't. You've been consumed with your work, your business for too long. You didn't see what was going on." Every word he says is like a knife to the heart. I heard what he was saying. But I couldn't believe it. He was trying to blame it on me, on the fact that I wasn't paying enough attention. It was his game, his way of justifying what he'd done. But I didn't care. I didn't want explanations, I didn't want excuses. All I wanted was to understand how it all happened. I was on the verge of breaking, and everything around me seemed to disappear at that moment. The world was like a blank canvas, and I stood on the edge, ready to lose everything. His words were tearing me from the inside out like sharp blades penetrating my heart. I sat in the chair, trying to gather my thoughts, but there were too many. My mind was reeling with memories of how she and I had made plans for the future, how we had talked about children, about old age, about how we would sit on the veranda, drinking wine and she would laugh. And now, sitting here, I was realizing that it was all a lie. We never seemed to be on the same page, never really partnered up like I thought we would be. You have no right to tell me it's my fault, it finally came out of me. I spoke in a low voice, holding back my rage, but with each word I was getting harder. I could have been a better husband. I could have been more attentive, but you should have told me. You should have been honest. And instead, you went to him. You went and ruined everything. He was silent for a few seconds, and then he spoke again, but not as calmly as before. Irritation flashed in his eyes, and I realized I'd really hurt him. You think it was easy for me? You think I didn't feel like something was wrong? We've both made mistakes, and you've made yours too. But you don't see that because in your life you've always tried to control everything. It was easier for you to work than to make time for your wife. His words were like a punch in the face. I couldn't believe that he was blaming me for being too busy working. That I was too late to notice what was going on. But at some point I realized he was right. I had been so consumed with my career that I hadn't noticed her drifting away from me. I had missed the moment when she was starting to look for someone else, and now I was paying the price. I couldn't stay calm. I stood up and walked over to him, feeling the tension building with every step. You're telling me it's my fault because I was working? That doesn't make any sense. You've been by my side all this time, we were building this house, we were building our future, and you decided to cheat. I will never understand that. How could you do that to me, to your husband, because I was hurting, too? You weren't there for me. You were busy, and I could feel it. And I'm not justifying what I did, but I couldn't keep quiet anymore. His voice grew quieter, but I felt that his truth was hidden in those words. The silence that followed those words felt like an eternity. I realized that this conversation would not lead to what I wanted to hear. He wouldn't give me forgiveness. He wouldn't give me an excuse. I thought that if I had this conversation, I could get answers that would soothe my soul. But the answers were only more dead ends. I abruptly turned around and walked towards the door. I needed to get out, I needed to get away so I wouldn't do anything I might regret later. And when I was almost out, I looked back at him, and his face remained as cold as ever. He didn't feel guilty. He didn't feel like he'd ruined someone else's life. He was there, like it was all part of some big play, and I was just an extra element in the game. You never realized it wasn't just an accident, he said with a cold smile. You were too busy, and I took a chance. You can't blame me for that. It's your fault I ended up here. I walked out, closing the door behind me, and stood outside for a long time, breathing in the cold air. My mind was in turmoil, and I didn't know what to do next. The feeling of loss became even stronger, and I felt the ground go from under my feet. I was trapped. On one hand, I knew I had to move on, but on the other hand, I was tied to what was still left. Thoughts of our family, of our children, of what I had lost, were more agonizing by the moment. But now everything changed. I couldn't go back. I couldn't just turn a blind eye to what had happened. I had to take action. And now I knew I would fight for my life, for my family, for my soul. I couldn't see where this path was leading. I didn't know how it would end, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them ruin my life and go through with it without consequences. I stood outside, the cold air burning my face, but I felt nothing but emptiness inside. My fingers clenched into fists and everything inside me was bubbling with anger, resentment, and pain. I didn't know how to move on. When you live with someone for so many years, building a life, believing in promises, in support, and suddenly that whole structure comes crashing down in an instant, it's not just a betrayal. It's like a blow to the heart. And even if you try to survive, that feeling stays with you. There can be nothing more important in life than trust. And now I was realizing that trust wasn't there. I leaned against the car, trying to exhale and calm down at least a little. The conversation I'd had with him, with her brother, was going through my head again. He'd said it was my fault. That was his logic. He wasn't interested in apologizing or explaining his actions. To him it was simply a consequence of my mistakes. He blamed me for being too consumed with work and not noticing my wife's estrangement from me. It was so unfair, but I guess everyone has their own truth, don't they? I felt a lump in my throat block my breath. Mentally I went back to the days when we first started living together. How proud I'd been to be able to build a life with her. And now I was standing here in the void, trying to figure out how it was that this person I'd been through so much with had betrayed me. And even worse, I found out that she wasn't going to tell me herself. She was hoping that everything would stay hidden, that I wouldn't find out about her cheating. My gaze fell to the cell phone I'd placed on the car seat. It was enough to convince me of the truth, I thought. He wasn't my friend. And I knew it. He was the one who came into her life when I was too busy to notice how much she needed support. His laughter, his looks, his words, it was all like an attraction for her. And I found myself in the background. I closed my eyes and remembered her smile, the same smile that always made me feel happy. How she'd hugged me, how she'd cooked dinner for the two of us, how she'd looked at me and I believed everything was going to be okay. All of that was gone, and now I was alone, all alone, where every look, every thought seemed foreign. My phone vibrated again. And I didn't want to pick it up, but I answered it anyway. It was her. Hi, her voice sounded anxious, but there was no regret or remorse in it. Did you hear everything? I asked, trying not to scream. Yes, I heard. Her voice was quiet, almost muffled. I don't know what to say. You don't know what to say. I grinned, but there was no humor in my voice. You think I didn't realize what happened? You think I can just forget? You destroyed everything. I didn't know what to do. Her voice faltered, and I realized she was trying to justify her actions. You weren't paying attention to me. I just felt alone. Her words pierced through me like a knife in the back. I couldn't believe she was saying this to me, that she was accusing me of being busy with work. I realized that her suffering was real, but how could you do this to someone you trusted like this? You can regret all you want, but it doesn't matter anymore. We can't go back to the past, and I can't forgive that. I spoke calmly, but every moment was like a lightning strike. You're not giving me a chance to make things right. She tried to justify herself again, but I was too tired to continue this conversation. All I want is for you to leave. Get your stuff and leave. My words were clear and decisive. I hung up the phone and got in my car. I needed to leave, not stay here, amidst these memories, amidst her presence, amidst this betrayal. I didn't know how I was going to handle it, but at least I knew one thing: I couldn't stay here. I couldn't be around her anymore. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and everything in my head felt like a fog. Questions plagued me, but I couldn't find any answers. Why had she done it? Why hadn't I noticed? Why had I allowed myself to be so vulnerable? With every kilometer I drove, I felt my soul clench even tighter. What was I supposed to do now? Memories of our life with her were piling up and I didn't know how to get out of it. I realized that the steps I had taken were not easy, but I had no other choice. At this point, I had become a stranger to myself. But what was I supposed to do? Stay with her, with a person who could just as easily betray as hold me close. Every meter I drove became more and more desperate. The farther I traveled, the harder it was to keep any sort of composure. Scenes from our past flashed through my mind: her eyes, the loving look in her eyes when we were just starting to build our lives. I remembered our first meeting, how we had happened to be close at that evening, how talking about the future had seemed easy and natural, and how nice it had been to feel her hand next to mine. To feel her care and support. All of those moments were real, and I believed they would always be. But now, when I faced the truth, everything was shattered, and I no longer had the strength to resist the pain. How could I not see her love slowly fading away? Why didn't I see her desperate attempt to find someone else who would understand her? Or maybe it was me not being willing to open up to her, not noticing her soul's longing. My brain refused to accept reality. And despite all the pain I was feeling, at some point it was like it all shifted. I just gritted my teeth and kept driving. I needed to get away from it all. To go somewhere where I could find some peace, if only for a while. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew for sure I didn't want to go home. I couldn't go back to that house where every corner reminded me of lies and betrayal. I couldn't be around the man who had so easily destroyed our memories anymore. I didn't know how we had gotten to this point, how I could have gotten myself into this situation, but now I had to find a way out, find a way to get through this pain, after hours of driving. I pulled to the side of the road, putting the car in park. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air. I sat there, staring into the darkening sky. The wind was crumpling my hair, and memories kept replaying in my head. Memories of her voice, of her caring, of being there for me when I was having a hard time. I tried to understand how that could have turned into something so devastating. How the very person I trusted was able to keep the truth from me. At some point I noticed how easily control was being lost. It wasn't me who was supposed to be broken, it was her. It wasn't like I'd done that to her. But she chose to betray me anyway. She chose him, her brother, my business partner. Someone I trusted. And now she kept looking for excuses. Why the hell did I have to put up with this? Why had all of this happened? Why did he think it would be okay? I mean, he knew I trusted him like I trusted myself. We were building a business together. We were partners. And now I was faced with a reality that left no hope of rebuilding that trust. And the worst part was that even now, in this moment, she didn't realize the gravity of her actions. She didn't realize how she had ruined us. I got back in the car and drove to the nearest hotel. It was empty, but I didn't want to go home. I just sat in the room and nothing could give me relief. I thought about what to do next. Do I continue my life with her? Or maybe I should try to let her go and start over. But how can you start over when you have such a wound in your heart? How can I go on with my life knowing that she could have done this? That she betrayed me, the one who loved her unconditionally. I didn't know how to move forward, but I had to do something. All I knew for sure was that I couldn't be the man in her life again. I was ready to close that chapter forever. I sat in silence, feeling the tension grow with each passing moment. The room was dark, with only the light from the window illuminating the empty space. I felt like a man who had lost everything he held dear. The thought that she could come back into my life again didn't seem possible. But here I was, sitting in this room, realizing that this was not the end, that there would be a new turn in my life. But what would it be? Every look, every step seemed alien and distant. I tried to remember how things used to be, before all this happened. When she and I seemed to be one, when our lives were not divided into before and after. I remembered her sincere smiles, her laughter when we spent time together, her support, her care. But now it all felt foreign. And I didn't know what to do with that feeling. Can you forgive? That question was like a poisonous arrow that pierced my thoughts time and time again. A simple question, but the answer was so complicated. I wasn't ready to forgive her. How could you forgive someone who broke your trust, who wasn't honest even with themselves? I couldn't just pick up and forget. It was more than just cheating. It was a betrayal of everything we built together. One day, while sitting in the office, I received a message from her again. This time she told me that she wanted to talk, to explain herself. But I already knew I couldn't be the one who could once listen to her excuses. There was too much pain and frustration inside of me to just put everything aside and start fresh. There was too much time and emotion I had put into this marriage to just start over. I felt like if I opened that door again, it would be closed again. And I would be back in a place I couldn't get out of. I decided not to answer anymore. It was hard, but probably the right decision. Sometimes, to move on, you just have to let go. And maybe this was the first step toward inner healing. It took a few weeks before I was able to pull myself together in any way. All the pain, all the frustration I was feeling seemed to come crashing down on me with incredible force. I couldn't get back to normal, no matter how hard I tried. It was as if I had become a different person, someone who once believed in love, in loyalty, in lasting relationships, had become disillusioned, broken, afraid to trust anyone. But there was one thing I knew for sure: I needed to move on. At some point, I realized that there were no people in my environment to support me in this moment. I was alone. And I was the only one who could decide how I was going to move on with my life. I don't know where my change started. Maybe it was the moment when I finally realized that I could no longer waste my life on something that was destroying me. Or maybe it was something internal that pushed me to find a way to live with this pain and not give up. Every morning when I woke up, I told myself that today I would take a step toward myself. Toward recovery. And with each day, with each step, I felt myself slowly letting go of her and her betrayal. I couldn't take back what was, and even if I wanted to, I knew it would never happen. She had chosen her path and I, though devastated by that choice,